may kakayanan na magpahusay ng kabuhayan Pilipino.
That we call on all patriotic Filipinos to discard ideological differences, party affiliations, disparity of religious beliefs and regional origins, to close our ranks, stand behind one flag, commit our honor, dedicate our lives to fight as best we can in defense of our country.
Ang ating katipunan. Ang ating katipunan. Ang palatuntunang maghahatid sa inyo ng mahahalagang impormasyon tungkol sa mga kaganapan sa loob at labas ng bansa.
Ang ating katipunan.
Magbibigay liwanag sa mga katanungang nagdudulot ng pagkalito sa mga mamamayan hango sa aral ng pandaigdigang kasaysayan.
Ang ating katipunan.
Makikinig sa inyong mga daing at kuro-kuro sa pagsusuri ng mga kasalukuyang suliranin ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo.
Ang ating katipunan.
Maglalatag ng kalutasan ng mga sanhi ng paghihirap ng kalagayan at kabuhayan ng sambayanan.
Ang ating katipunan.
Ihahatid sa inyo ni Itos Valdes ng Philippine LaRouche Society at Partido Politikal ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino kasama si Cathy Cruz.
Oras sa hudyat, 2 minuto makalipas ang ikapito ng gabi, Philippine Standard Time. At kayo po ay nakikinig dito pa rin sa himpilan ng RMN DZXL 558 kHz AM band at sabayan niyo po kaming napapanood sa pamamagitan ng social media accounts ng Katipunan Channel. Ngayon po ay araw ng Linggo, ika-16 ng Hunyo 2024. It's June 16, 2024. Ang himpilang ito ay kasapi ng KBP, Kapisanan ng mga Broadcaster ng Pilipinas. Magandang gabi po mga katipon sa Pilipinas at sa buong mundo. Ito po ang inyong katipon, Cathy Cruz, na inyo pong makakasama sa loob po ng 2 oras. At sa lahat po ng ating mga masugid na taga-subaybay, anuman po ang inyong ginagawa, saan man pong panig kayo ng mundo naroon, halina po kayo at samahan niyo po kami mga masugid na taga-subaybay. Anuman po ang inyong ginagawa, saan man pong panig tayo tuluyan na umusad sa atin, ay pabatiin muna natin ang Pangulo ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino. Magandang gabi sa iyo, Itos.
Magandang gabi, Cathy. I cannot hear you well, pero magandang gabi sa lahat ng tagapanood and our followers on our radio program. Please follow us also on YouTube, on Twitter, at Rumble, at Facebook, at lahat na pwedeng salihan ng Katipunan Demokratikong Pilipino. At medyo nagigipit na yung mga ating mga kaibigan dito pag hindi nila gusto ang lumalabas. Pero tayo, maninindigan po tayo na ilabas ang katotohanan para po sa mamamayang Pilipino. Good evening.
Thank you, Itos. At syempre, katulad po ng lagi po nating sinasabi sa inyo, no? Ang ating pong Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, ang Katipunan Channel, particularly ang ating pong palatuntunang ang ating Katipunan, no? Bagamat yumao po na ang leader o ang nagsimula po nito ay na walang iba po kundi si Professor Valdes, ay patuloy po kaming maninindigan sa katotohanan at sa tama po. Anyway, ang topic po natin ngayong gabi ay tungkol po sa nuclear war o BRICS. So, yan po yung ating magiging topic. At alam nyo po ba, naging umingay po hindi lamang sa social media, kundi maging sa mainstream ngayon, ang tungkol po sa nangyaring isang press conference sa United States National Press Club, ginawa. Ang emergency press conference pong ito na pinamagatan pong The Danger of Nuclear War is Real. and must be stopped. Yan po ang theme, no, ng press conference, emergency press conference na itinagawa po ng Schiller Institute. At ilan po sa mga masasabi nating talagang matatapang at mga eksperto po, no, sa iba't ibang larangan ay ang mga tagapagsalita po na sina Scott Ritter. Siya po ay ang former UN Weapons Inspector and US Marine Intelligence Officer. Bukod po dyan, nandyan din po ang dating senador po ng US na si Richard Black. Dati po siyang head po ng US Army's Criminal Law Division sa Pentagon. Dati pong senador, katulad ng sinabi ko sa inyo kanina. At kasama pa rin si Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Siya po ang Chief of Staff to Secretary of State noong 2002 hanggang 2005, no, sa United States. At syempre, nandun din ang founder ng Schiller Institute na si Helga Zepp LaRouche. At syempre, marami pa rin ibang mga nandun din, naging nagsilbing moderator din si Dennis Speed. Anyway, siguro itos magandang iparinig natin ang isang mahalagang excerpt lang, no, dito sa naganap na emergency press conference ng Schiller Institute na kung saan po ay dinaluhan po ng inyong lingkod at nagkaroon po tayo ng magandang pagkakataon na makapagtanong po sa mga eksperto pong ito. Panoorin po natin.
Okay, we're going to take one final question, which is from the Philippines, and then we're going to have some will probably be more than interested after this discussion that there's an organization called the International Peace Coalition. The person who convenes that each week is Anastasia Battle, who's here to my left, and I'm going to have her say something about that at the very conclusion. I think there's 1,700 people still with us. All of you are invited, if you are people of goodwill, which we presume many of you to be, to seek us out and become part of that action. So we'll go to the final question, which I mentioned is from Philippines, and it is from Maria Catherine Suba from Radio Mindanao Network.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's already 2:57 a.m. here in the Philippines. I am Maria Catherine Cruz Suba, a freelance broadcaster. I am a co-host of late Butch Valdes with Itos Valdes in Radio Mindanao Network DZXL, ang Ating Katipunan show. My question goes to Mr. Scott Ritter. As a former UN Weapons Inspector and US Marine Intelligence Officer, and actually to anyone else who wants to answer, a proxy war is being orchestrated in this part of the world, our country, the Philippines. Our country is actually being used by the US in its intent of war against China. And according to geopolitical analysts, the Philippines will be the next Ukraine. The Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has allowed additional 9 EDCA sites, or more appropriately, 9 US military bases all over the country. The armed forces of the Philippines seem to be following orders from their US counterpart. Drumbeats of war is being heard almost every day. Xenophobia is being propagated on mainstream media. Almost every week, there's an incident of Chinese Coast Guard that water cannons a Philippine vessel at the South China Sea. Do you think a false flag operation can happen here as tensions are getting worse? What do you propose for this to stop? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Just so you know, I have a little bit of background in the Philippines. In 1986, I was deployed there as a platoon commander to reinforce the Subic garrison after the fall of the Marcos regime. There was concern about the new People's Army. So I have a warm spot in my heart for the Philippines. Let's build upon what Colonel Wilkerson had said earlier. The United States is incapable of fighting a sustained conflict against a peer-level force. The United States cannot fight and engage China and win. We will not beat the Chinese. We cannot beat the Chinese, and we know this, and yet we're using the Philippines to create the conditions of potential conflict with the Chinese. Please understand that for the Filipino people, this is a recipe for disaster. You think America is your friend. So too did the Ukrainian people. And they are dying by the hundreds of thousands. Friends don't let friends die in those quantities. The Ukrainians have been displaced by the tens of millions. Friends don't let friends have their cities destroyed in this manner. Friends don't let friends have families separated, have mothers and children destined to a life of refugee status in perpetual poverty. That's not how friends behave. America has never been the friend of the Ukrainians, and we are not the friends of the Filipinos. We don't like you. If we did like you, we wouldn't be doing this to you. We are using you. You are a tool, nothing but a tool, and when the tool ceases to be useful, we will discard you. And discard you means usually after a war that devastates you. We are using you to gain some sort of momentary leverage over the Chinese. We will fail. The Chinese will win, and you will be destroyed. End of story. It's high time the Filipino people pressure their government to start sitting down and engaging the Chinese government responsibly. China is not your enemy. China is your neighbor. China is your friend. China doesn't want war. And if you would engage China in diplomacy, and as we've all indicated here, America has long since lost the skill set necessary to carry out diplomacy, but the Filipinos, the Philippine people can reignite this, to relearn it, to use this skill to prevent a war. But if you continue to behave as colonial subjects, and I know that's a sore subject in the Philippines, because you were the colonial subjects of America. We still view you as our colonial subjects. We don't like you, we don't care about you, we just want to use you. Grow up. Grow up and act responsibly. Take control of your own future. America is not here to help you. America is here only to use you until there's nothing left, and then we will discard you on the trash heap of history.
I must tell you, I spent a lot of time in the Philippines and came in off the carrier Iwo Jima, the Valley Forge, the Guadalcanal, and both, Scott would agree with me. Americans have a tremendous love for the Filipino people. I would say two of my very, very closest friends are from the Philippines. And we really wish very much that you were not in this posture. But I think it's very important for the Philippines to be clear-eyed in what's going on and not to be led down the path by bellicose military people from the United States. You're talking about small islands. I wish China were not engaged in that particular policy. I tend to be sympathetic towards them on many things, but less so on that one. But at the same time, I think you've got to make sort of a cold, clear-eyed assessment and say, look, it's not worth a war with a great power for the Philippines to engage in combat over those small islands. But I do agree that it is time to use diplomacy and to attempt to resolve the issue. Whatever you do, do not simply become a tool of the United States and be led into an armed conflict that ends up in disaster for the Filipino people. Because if you do, you will break the heart of a whole lot of us who just dearly love the Philippines and the people of the islands.
Okay, so we're at the point of summary remarks. I want to start with Larry Wilkerson. And of course, if there's anything you wish to address that hasn't been addressed already, please feel free to do so. And we'll then proceed. Go ahead.
I'll just add to what was just said. I thought when Teddy Allen brought Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Marcos to Pearl, and we escorted them up to Camp Smith, that the Philippines had finally awakened and thrown us out. and that we would never be back. And then I saw Donald Rumsfeld take advantage of 9/11 and start infiltrating special forces back into the Philippines. And I knew the game was back on again. So I agree with what both Scott and Colonel Black said. There's a lot of affection on my part for the Philippines too. But you should grow up and not need the United States and not put the United States and China at loggerheads over your dead body, because that's what it will be about. The topic here today was nuclear weapons. And I'll just say this again, the most likely state owning nuclear weapons today to use those nuclear weapons again is the United States. And we have put ourselves in that position and in that posture by our incompetence at the other skill sets, most prominently diplomacy, necessary for the relations of nations. We are not a very competent, in any vein of diplomacy, entity anymore. There's an old principle of the relations of nations called conservation of enemies. Simply stated, it says that a prudent state never has any more enemies at any one time than it can handle. We have 3.6 billion and growing every day, probably by 100 million a week, people who hate our guts, who detest us, who are fed up with us, who think the rules-based order is our rules and orders to them. That's not going to last. It's not going to preserve us. It's not going to preserve our empire in any way, fashion, or form. So if we don't change very quickly, we're going down. And what I would advise people like the Philippines and Australia and other of our good allies over this last 50, 60, 70 years is to check your six really closely and see what you can do to make accommodations with the other powers in the world, most prominently Russia and China, but India is big time in there too. India will be a replacement for China if she just keeps her act together for the next 20 years. And then we'll have those two countries at loggerheads. But you're looking at a dying empire. You're looking at a dying empire. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to have a really bad death rather than a death, say, like Britain had, where she is still around. Stupidly led by Rishi Sunak, but soon to be gotten rid of, probably. So it's a different world. It's a totally different world. It's no longer unipolar. It's multipolar. And it's going to act that way. It's going to have a new financial system, a new monetary exchange system, a new banking system. Everything's going to be new. And we're going to be on the outside unless we learn to accommodate. And you learn to accommodate with that deft instrument of national power called diplomacy. So we'd rather grow some diplomats and fast.
Okay, napanood po ninyo ang nangyaring press conference po, at ito ay ang pagsama-sama po ng mga anti-war advocate po sa US para bigyang babala ang mundo sa nakaabang nuclear Armageddon, no? Sa nangyari nga po inorganisa ng Schiller Institute. At isa-isang ipinaliwanag ito ng mga eksperto at mga dating opisyal ng Estados Unidos, ng gobyerno po ng Estados Unidos, kung gaano kadelikado ang nuclear war. So, Itos?
Yes, Kat. No, I wanted to comment lang kasi maraming, since after that Schiller conference, no, naglabas tayo ng mga videos at pinink up to ng mga kaibigan natin sa media at yung mga vloggers at syempre ang tanging gusto nilang magka-reaction and yung mga headline nila is yung sinasabi po sa yung reaction ni Scott Ritter. Now, if you know Scott Ritter, just a little bit of a background on Scott Ritter. He was a US military intelligence. Tapos UN, sumama siya sa UN as weapons inspector when they went to Iraq. I think this was 2003 or... Kasi, ang pinapalabas dati, kung maalala po natin lahat, dati, itinutulak ni George Bush at yung mga US establishment, ng gobyerno ng US, na ang Iraq ay may weapons of mass destruction. At kinumbinsin nila, kasama na yung si Tony Blair, if I believe, ng Prime Minister ng England at yung mga iba ng Germany at lahat sa UN na kailangan pasukin ang Iraq at ibomba ng UN. So kinukumbinsin nila na ang Iraq ay may weapons of mass destruction. Ngayon, itong si Scott Ritter na pumunta doon, dahil sa integridad po niya, sinabi niya na wala silang tinatagong UN weapons. Mula noon, sinaraan na siya sa media, tas may mga kaso siya na pinataw sa kanya. Okay? So this was in maybe 2010, 20. So he became parang the enemy of the state kasi nagsabi siya ng totoo na walang weapons of mass destruction. And years later, nalaman ng taong bayan, wala pala. At pinasukan nila yung Iraq, sinira nila yung Iraq, okay, on a false premise. Tapos, ang dami nilang pinatay, okay, sabi nila, masama daw yung Iraq, masama. So, ginera nila yung Iraq, kinuha si Saddam, at pinatay nila si Saddam. Pinatawan ng korte, kunwari, na tinatawag natin kangaroo court, hindi naman totoong korte, at pinapatay. Okay? Iyan ang ginagawa ng US Intelligence Services. Itong mga Scott Ritter, Richard Black, and si Wilkerson, these are all very credible and respected military experts. Okay? And these guys are sticking their necks out. And sinasabi nila, itong nangyayari ngayon, napakadelikado. Kasi ang intensyon ng US admin ngayon, ni Biden, at yung mga nagko-control kay Biden at yung mga military adventurists ng US and CIA are all pushing for war. Okay? Siyempre, yung local media natin nagugulat kasi itong nakita nila, itong Amerikano and former military expert ay nagsalita against what the US is doing here in China. Kaya minabuti nag-attend si Cathy at si Ver ng press con, madaling araw po yun, at nag-question sila. Maganda yung question po ni Cathy. At sinagot naman nila. Ang dapat tuunan ng pansin ng local media, ang sinasabi po ni Scott Ritter at ni Colonel Black at ni Colonel Wilkerson is for the Philippines, the Philippine establishment, ibig sabihin, armed forces, leadership, Senate, the admin, is to grow up. Stop allowing yourselves to be used for this kind of military adventurism na hindi tayo magbe-benefit from. Okay, yan ang dapat tuunan ng pansin ng media. Hindi yung hirit ni ang style ni Scott Ritter, gisingin po tayo. Kaya ganyan siya magsalita. Para siyang sinatawag na tough love. Para matauhan po tayo. Okay? At kakatuwa nga may nakita ako mga reaction sa mga ibang video, bayad daw si Scott Ritter ng China at Russia. Yan, partly yung mga nagsasabi niyan, partly, I would say, they're trolls, number one. Number two, tanga. Mga tanga sila. Hindi sila nag-iisip. Kasi ang nasa utak lang nila, China bad, US good. Yun lang. At wala na silang maisip na Ibig sabihin, hindi sila nagbabasa ng history, hindi sila nagbabasa ng Yun po. At yung mga eksperto natin na ini-interview dyan sa mga media, mainstream media, I'm sure nagugulat sila na may mga ganito. Kasi yung tinatawag nilang expert advice nila is really just propaganda from one side. Okay, so it was a good interview at kinakalat na ngayon, and the Filipinos should learn from this. And kung napansin niyo, gusto ko lang may emphasize Yung tatlong yan, sinasabi nila ang dami nilang experience sa sa Pilipinas in different parts, in different eras, and they have a soft spot for the Philippines. Naiinis sila. Kaya sila ganyan magsalita. Naiinis sila kasi ginagamit na naman tayo. Yan ang lumalabas niyan. Okay? So I think we should take it as a mature people. We should look at it that way. Na parang grow up nga. Huwag na tayo magpagamit. Engage as an adult with the US and China. And diplomatically, sabi nga ni Scott Ritter, yung US di na marunong mag-diplomacy. Puro gera na lang. Yan ang natutunan nila. Pero ang Pilipinas, baka pwedeng to engage as equals with China and the US na parang ayaw namin ng ganito na lang. Hindi yun po yung sunod-sunuran. Gusto ko lang ma-emphasize yun. And that video has been trending and going around with views. A lot of people are picking it up. And it's good kasi para siyang nakakagulat na may ganito. And I would encourage rin yung mga kaibigan natin na nanonood o nakikinig, mag-research po tayo. Pumunta tayo sa X, pumunta tayo sa YouTube, maghanap tayo yung mga links na binibigay po natin at nakikita nyo. Matuto po tayo, mag-ano tayo ng konting history. At you have a wider perspective on what's happening. Kasi nga, sabi nga ni yung sa huli, si Wilkerson, sabi niya, iba na po yung mundo. Ibang-iba na. It's called a multipolar world. Ibig sabihin, there will be centers of influence around the world, iba-iba. And that's what we will discuss moving forward, no? The other thing is that, Cathy, you have any more reaction before we go to the next video?
Actually, ang isa sa tumimo din doon sa mga sinabi ni Scott Ritter, no, Itos, yung salita niya coming from a American soldier, China doesn't want war. Hindi gusto ng China na magkaroon ng gera. Kaya ang pinaka-importante, katulad nga ng nabanggit mo rin, is engage China in diplomacy. At makikita mo talaga na siya mismo naniniwala. Meron pa nga siya isang sinabi na we cannot beat China. America cannot beat China. Diba yung mga ganon na mga speech? Pero hindi yun eh. Ang importante is that sa isang bansa na katulad ng China na ang tingin ng mga propagandista, no, na masama, dinedemonize nila ang China, na kabaligtaran sa sinasabi ni Scott Ritter na isang Amerikanong sundalo, isang eksperto pagdating sa mga digmaan, 'di ba? Na nagsasabi na hindi yan ang gusto ng China. Hindi gusto ng China na magkaroon ng gera. Yun ang importante sa akin, Itos.
Yes, and I want to build on what you said, no? Yung sinasabi niyang China is not your enemy, China is your friend.
Yes.
Look, China is not, hindi naman sinasabi namin na China, anghel yung China. Hindi naman either or yan. The point being is China has their own interests, correct? But it is not in their interest to wage war against any nation. Now, if we get into a deal with China, interesado ang China makipag-deal in terms of economic projects or development. E di doon tayo sumama. Ba't tayo sasama sa isang bansa na gusto lang magkagera? Right? So, that's what he's saying. Hindi po namin sinasabi na anghel yung China, anghel yung ibang bansa, Russia. They have their own interest. But they're willing to make a deal, just like business partnership. Eh, ba't di na lang gano'n? Diba? So, and you know, when Scott Ritter said, we cannot win a war against China. Kasi po, these guys, coming from these military experts po, yung sinasabi lang we cannot win a war, may iba pa nga nagsasabi, yung iba, si Colonel McGregor and the others, sinasabi lang, tanga-tanga ng US gusto nila lumaban sa Russia, gusto nila kalabanin yung China, tapos may Israel, Gaza. Tatlo-tatlo ang kakalabanin nila. Sabi nga ni World Person, 3.6 billion ang kalaban na natin na tao. Because that is the global south. That's the population of the global south. India, China, Brazil, BRICS. Yan ang kalaban na ng US kasi tanga-tanga ng US and this administration, they seem to want war. And the world is changing already, and we will go through those developments. Meantime, di ba, recently, Cathy, may dumating si
Zelensky.
si Zelensky. Sabi niya may peace process daw, may peace conference daw. So nagka-peace conference nga, natatawa yung mga tao kasi wala China, wala Russia. And yung mga statements ng Saudi Arabia doon sa Switzerland is the prerequisites for a peace conference are not met. Wala kasi yung si Russia, wala kasi si China. So, anong klaseng peace conference to? Tapos, pala, and we will see in this next report, ilang beses na ginagawa ni Zelensky yan, umiikot at nagpi-peace conference at pinupush niya yung mga agenda niya. Pero wala pa rin nangyayari sa Ukraine. Talo at talo sila. So nagtatanong ngayon lahat ng bansa o yung mga taong nag-iisip sa buong mundo at nakikita nila yung ano ba talagang papel nitong si Zelensky na nag-suspend ng elections ang kanyang bansa. So effectively, diktador siya. Pag nag-diktador, dapat i-recognize muna ng UN, di ba? At susuportahan ba ng US to na diktador? Di ba? So ito yung nangyayari. Nakakatawa yung peace conference na kunwari, pero it looks, and nangyayari dyan, it looks like a propaganda. So let's look at this report where I think the video on the peace conference kunwari sa Switzerland para we get a sense, tapos react na kami ni Cathy.
In Bergenstock, Switzerland today, there is a peace conference that has just started. It's going to be going today and tomorrow to try and find some way to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Or at least that's what it says on the surface of it. I mean, it's for a peace settlement. It's called a peace conference. But when you look underneath the surface here, strange things seem to come up. And we've got a really great guest to help us unpack some of this today, who's from Switzerland. And we have Colonel Jacques Beau back. He was on our show a couple of days ago talking on some of the issues of the war. But there's no better person to have to talk about this on this topic. And we're really grateful to have you back again today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back to the show. Thank you.
And it's always good. I mean, you always have such great insight here, and you seem to always have stuff to show that most of our audience doesn't even know about. And I can't imagine that's going to be the case again today here. But I want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to discuss here, because this is the strangest peace conference that's with that title I've ever seen in my life. Because ordinarily, one would think, if you've got a conflict and you've got side A and side B, and you want to have a negotiated settlement to end it, and a just peace, which is a phrase I've heard, you would think you would have the two sides sitting there and potentially some other sides as well. But as we'll see in this following clip here, that's not the case here. Watch this.
A peace summit launched by Ukraine looks in trouble even before it's begun. President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked global leaders to attend the talks in Switzerland in June, but without much success so far. You see, the US President, Joe Biden, is planning to skip the gathering. Russia hasn't even been invited, and the leaders of China, India and Brazil may not turn up. That's left EU ministers scrambling to find a solution. With Israel's war raging in Gaza and Russian and Ukrainian troops locked in what looks like a near stalemate, Kyiv is desperate to keep world attention on the conflict at home. What can it hope to achieve if Moscow isn't there?
Indeed, if the other half of the party's not there, one's got to wonder, what are you even trying to accomplish? As best as you understand, what is the purpose, the actual purpose of this so-called peace summit?
Well, it's even more bizarre because if you look at it, this is the 7th conference on exactly the same topic with the same participants. And we see that there was this, in fact, this is the seventh time that Zelensky presents his so-called 10 points formula. It started as a 5-point formula that it was presented to the UN General Assembly in September 2022. Later, it was developed into a 10 points plan, but basically it's exactly the same points. And it was presented in the G20, then in Copenhagen and so on. And each time it's ended as a failure, basically, because again, for exactly the same reason, you have only one participant. Basically, you had only Western countries attending the conference, and of course, everybody applauded to Zelensky, and that was it. But this didn't help to solve any question and didn't address any of the realities on the ground. If you look at the points, in fact, you can see that probably I presented that on this channel, I don't remember, but in any case, these are in essence the 10 points that are developed in this peace formula. I don't want to go each of the point. It's sufficient to say that almost each of these points are based on a resolution of the UN. So as to radiation and nuclear safety, that was a resolution taken after the issue on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in summer 2022. Food security, that was a resolution that was taken after the issue of the circulation on the Black Sea also in summer 2022, and so on and so forth. So basically, we have 10 points. But the interesting point here is that it addresses the withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities. So basically, it's a plan that provides for the capitulation of Russia. And we have to probably to understand that, because it's totally disconnected from the reality on the ground. But the explanation of that is that this plan was first designed before the so-called summer offensive that we had in summer 2023. And it was expected, at least on the Ukrainian side and probably on the Western side as well, that this counteroffensive would lead to the disruption of the Russian forces in Ukraine and eventually leads to victory. And that, on this basis, this plan or this formula was designed. As a result, in that context, with the anticipation of a success, then you can understand the setup of the setting of this plan. The problem is that, as we know today, the counteroffensive was never successful at no point in time and didn't bring any success. In fact, at the end of the counteroffensive, even as it was reported by the New York Times, the Russians gained more territory than the Ukrainians. So basically, absolutely no success. The problem is that Zelensky kept exactly the same plan. And he presented this plan in Malta last year, and the Swiss government offered to discuss the plan once again.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to ask you about that, because I cannot understand, why would the Swiss government want to put their name and their credibility and their reputation that they've got for decades, even centuries really, of being a peacemaking kind of entity, but there's something that can't lead to peace. Why did they agree to do this when they knew it wasn't going to include Russia?
Well, thank you for asking the question. And even though I'm Swiss, I'm not able to answer it. This is totally irrational.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people in the Swiss, including the Swiss military, don't understand what is the purpose of all that. And even don't understand the stance of the Swiss government, because remember that in 2022, Switzerland was one of the first countries to apply sanctions on Russia. And for a while, up to October 2022, Switzerland was even the country that sanctioned more Russia, even more than the US, even more than the EU.
Didn't know that.
So it's absolutely incredible. Today, as of today, the last figures of June 2024, Switzerland is the third most sanctioning country over Russia, even more than the EU, even more than Canada or Australia. No, not Canada. I think Australia, and probably more than the UK, and more than Japan, and so on. So this is totally incomprehensible from a Swiss point of view, because Switzerland has always managed to be neutral. And as you know, neutrality was even imposed to Switzerland in the early 19th century. And since it was imposed by the so-called big powers, or great powers as they were called at that time, like France, Germany, Italy at that time, and this neutrality was considered as recognized or acknowledged by everybody. And that's a reason why this neutrality was never violated during World War I and World War II. But somehow, and even during the Cold War, we managed to be neutral, even if we were closer to the West than the East, for obvious reasons. But in any case, we managed to keep this neutrality. And today, with this conflict in Ukraine, everything has been thrown overboard, and the neutrality basically doesn't exist anymore. And as the Ukrainian government, by the way, asked Switzerland to represent their interests in Russia, because we have an embassy in Moscow, of course, and the Ukraine and Switzerland asked to be acknowledged to be representing the Ukrainian interest in Moscow. The Russian foreign ministry refused to say, well, why should we accept that you represent Ukrainian interests? You are supposed to be neutral.
So yan lang video, no? Second video po, no, Itos. At kita mo yung 10-point peace plan ni Zelensky, ito ibang-iba dun sa inilalatag ng binanggit ng Schiller Institute. Ito.
Yeah. Hindi sincere kasi si Zelensky. Ang pinapalabas ng interviewer, na former Swiss military guy, si Valdes or something. Sabi niya, marami nang pinopropose si Zelensky. Una, 2014, 3-point plan, tapos naging 10-point plan, tapos naging 5-point plan. Marami siyang pinopropose na hindi naman talagang, hindi mo pwedeng iseryoso kasi masyadong pagka sa negosasyon, sa peace, hindi mangyayari. Tapos, the other thing is this, nakalimutan kong ilagay yung video pero right before yung event na yan sa Switzerland, naglabas si Putin ng kanyang offer to peace. At sinabi niya, ito yung, sige, ceasefire tayo, pero so may may demand siya. Labas kayo sa mga region na ayaw sa inyo, sa Ukraine, na inaapin niyo yung mga tao. At wag na kayong sumali sa NATO. Pag ganyan, titigil kami. Kasi po, bakit ganyan po si Putin? Contrary, taliwas ba, Cathy, yung name?
Taliwas.
Taliwas sa sinasabi ng mga kaibigan natin sa media o nire-report nila at pinapalabas dito. Yung Ukraine, wala na pong hindi na kayang lumaban. Kaya humihingi at humihingi siya ng pera. Umiikot siya. Yan na lang ginagawa niya. Sinuspindi niya yung eleksyon niya. Tapos, kumukuha pa sila ng mga tao on the streets para lumaban. Ibato dyan sa frontline para mamatay. Para lang may masabing may lumalaban for them. Wala na. Tapos nagda-draft na nga sila ng babae. Dati mga lalaki lang na pwedeng lumaban dyan sa frontline sa Ukraine. Ngayon mga babae na rin ang kinukuha niya. So inaapi niya yung kanyang mga tao. Mga taong bayan ng Ukraine, the Ukrainians, are even being forced to fight. And this is what's happening. And the Russians are not pushing forward as fast because ayaw nilang saktan yung mga civilian. Okay, ito si Zelensky, again, sinasabi natin, tignan nyo yung history ni Zelensky personally. Makikita nyo yan online, sa X, sa YouTube even. He is a actor. Komedyante yan. Yan ang karir niya, showbiz. At nilagay lang siya doon ng US dahil nagkudeta sila against Poroshenko 2014. Okay? At 2014 naglagay na sila ng mga armas. At binobomba-bomba na nila yung Donetsk region at yung mga border cities near Russia since 2014. At galit na galit si Putin doon. Kaya siya lumusob kasi naglalagay na sila ng mga missile sites diyan malapit. Okay? Kailangan gumalaw na siya. Kaya siya nag-special operations. That's the whole reason. And then now, ang ginagawa ni Zelensky at yung NATO ay pwede na daw ibomba yung Russia from NATO and from Ukraine and other NATO countries. Gagalaw si Putin. Ang latest na balita po natin ay si Zelensky at nireject niya. Siyempre, expected, nireject niya yung proposal ni Putin. Sabi ni Putin, ito talaga yung peace deal kung gusto mo. Kumbaga, lamang na ako pero binibigyan pa siya ng pagkakataon para ayoko nang patayin yung mga tao mo. Yan ang si Putin. And he stated this. Pero nireject kasi sabi nilang NATO, huwag mong tanggapin yan. O, sige. Sabi nga ng mga military expert, tanga-tanga nang hindi niya alam kung wala silang laban sa Russia. Ang Russia ay number 1 sa number of nuclear missiles sa mundo. And they are probably the best fighting force now. Hindi na yung Amerika. Yan ang sinasabi nila ni ni Scott Ritter and the rest. Hindi kaya ng Amerika, hindi tayo sanay lumaban. Sanay tayo lumaban sa mga third world countries. Pero against a real power like Russia and China, mahabaan yung digmaan, hindi natin kaya yung ekonomiya natin sira. Russia is probably the number 1 exporter of oil now sa Europe and the rest of the world. And China is number 1 manufacturing. Paano mo tatalunin yan? Remember po, ang nanalo po ang US sa World War II dahil sa manufacturing. Number 1 sila sa production and manufacturing ng goods and services. Kaya sila nanalo. Kasi yung gera, hindi po isang beses lang. Pero ngayon klase yung gera, and ngayon, because it's nuclear, pag gumamit ng nuclear, either tactical or conventional, delikado na po yan. Yan ang sinasabi ni Putin. Huwag nyo kaming takutin, sasabihin ni Putin. Hindi kami takot manggamit ng nuclear kung pupwersa nyo kami. Kaya po nandito na tayo sa malapit na sa World War III. We've never been nasa. And the other news dyan sa Twitter po, nagmo-mobilize na yung NATO forces, nagpapadala na ng mga soldiers yung iba't ibang countries sa mga border ng Russia. Alam po ni Putin yan. Alam na alam niya at naghahanda na sila. Delikado po tayo. Kasama po tayo dyan. Diba? Again, we were warning of this na matagal na. So that is where we are, and that is where the updates on those situations. No? But there is another. Cathy, you want to react one more time before we go to the next video?
Sige, hindi, okay na ako.
Okay.
Excited ako
Okay.
sa susunod na video eh.
Tapos, on top of that, nag-iba na yung financial system ng mundo. Okay? People don't realize how bad this is. What bad, but good in a sense because kailangan na talagang palitan, pero bad for us because we are hanging on with the US and the West and Britain and the rest of their old financial system. Recently, yung Saudi Arabia ended the petrodollar system. Alam niyo po yung petrodollar system ay nag-umpisa 1971. Sabi ng US sa Saudi, deal tayo. Hindi kayo makibebenta ng langis sa buong mundo kundi gamit yung dollar. So for 50 years, yan po yung sistema. Kasi tanda ko po yun, yung sistemang yun, 1971. Okay? For 50 years, yun yung sistema. At for 50 years, yan po ang nagpapalakas sa dollar. Kasi po, ang US since then have been declining in their manufacturing. Ina-outsource po nila manufacturing and services. So, pakonti, on purpose po to ha, pakonti pababa yung kalidad ng US in terms of manufacturing. And now, Saudi Arabia says, we are not renewing that arrangement. We will end that 50-year arrangement. So, that's what you call dollar decoupling. Hindi na sila attached to the US dollar. And that goes to China and Russia also. Now, you can buy oil by many different currencies. So, yung tinatawag nilang petrodollar system na siya nagpapalakas sa US dollar for the past 50 years is now dead. And I'd like to show this report because this is like an earthquake or tsunami or a nuclear bomb in the financial world because it affects all transactions, institutions based on that 50-year system. At nakakatuwa kasi yung mga bangko dito at yung mga business at yung mga ano dito, walang nagsasalita about that. Yung mga analyst dito sa Pilipinas na napakatalino kuno, hindi nila dinidiscuss po yun. That's probably the biggest news. And the BRICS is coming up. The BRICS is real. The BRICS is here. Kumbaga, sabi nga ni LaRouche, a decade ago, more than a decade, the Titanic has struck the iceberg. Either malunod tayo kasi matigas ang ulo natin or punta na tayo sa lifeboats na BRICS. So I want to show this other video, this next video on it, and then we can react on it, Cathy.
Okay.
Well, everything is changing quickly for the US dollar, and in this past week we've seen two major events that are going to completely change the future of our world. The first event was the announcement of a new BRICS payment system that will in fact challenge the status of the US dollar in international transactions. But what's even bigger is the shocking announcement that after a 50-year run, the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia to export oil exclusively in US dollars has officially ended on June 9th, 2024. And guess what? The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has decided to not renew its partnership with the US and instead will open up the Saudis' lucrative oil trade to other countries and currencies. Trust me, this is a massive blow to the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. For the past 50 years, the US government has mandated that oil must be sold exclusively in US dollars, elevating the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. It was honestly one of the most lucrative decisions the US government has ever made. But a world in where America is the sole superpower is officially over. Earlier this week, Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia has now joined a China-led central bank digital currency project in what could be another step towards less of the world's oil trade being done in US dollars. Last week, US Congressman Thomas Macy made an appearance on Tucker Carlson's podcast and gave one of the most authentic breakdowns of what's happening with the US dollar. Trust me, there are very few politicians in Washington who are actually worth listening to, but Congressman Macy doesn't sugarcoat what is really happening.
And we can do that as long as they use our currency, but I think it's going to end at some point. They're going to quit using our dollars as reserve currency. I mean, I watched your interview with Putin. One of the things he said that is true is when we sanctioned him, before we sanctioned Russia, 70% of their transactions were in US dollars. And after the sanctions, it's less than 20% of their transactions are in US dollars.
Ironically, every time the US government introduces a new economic sanction, it moves the world one step closer to de-dollarization. To be honest, the exact same thing is happening with the US government's microchip battle against China. The US doesn't want China to have access to America's best microchips, so in turn, they sanction China. But what does China do as a result? They invest in their domestic microchip industry, and within a few years are quickly closing the innovation gap. The best thing to ever happen to the Chinese semiconductor industry was getting sanctioned by the US government. This forced China to change and get stronger. If the US government continues to weaponize the US dollar and enforce sanctions, it opens the door for much larger problems.
And we're also sending a really clear signal, which is the dollar's not safe for you.
Right.
It's the reserve currency because it's a safe haven, because it's a stable country. It's the most stable country in the world, and we're not going to weaponize the dollar because that would be shooting ourselves. But suddenly we are.
Of course, we can see this unfolding in real time as well. Earlier this week, Joe Biden and French President Macron reached an agreement to use the profits of frozen Russian assets to send additional funding to Ukraine. This is a dangerous move from the US and French governments because it not only violates international law, but it exposes how much at odds Western leaders are with their populations on Ukraine. Last week, the Institute of Global Affairs published this groundbreaking study which reveals 94% of Americans and 88% of Western Europeans believe that NATO member countries should push for a negotiated settlement for the war in Ukraine. Literally 9 out of 10 citizens in both Western Europe and the US want this war in Ukraine to end, but our democratically elected officials, who are supposed to represent the people they serve, have other plans. Once again, this strategy will be a disaster for Western governments over the long term.
But one of the things we recently did in Congress, we passed something called the Repo Act, where we said we're just going to seize all of Russia's sovereign assets in the United States. Well, it turns out a lot of that is treasury debt that they've agreed to buy so that they can hold dollars. When people see that we've seized their money that they gave us in exchange for these treasury notes, then other countries won't want to buy our debt.
As I mentioned before, the US government has weaponized the dollar to the point where other countries are watching and are concerned about the long-term effects of holding too much dollars. One of those countries is, of course, China, who was once the largest holder of US Treasury bonds. At its peak, China held over $1 trillion worth of Treasury bonds, but after the US launched a trade war against China, China has shifted their strategy. They no longer want to hold excessive amounts of US Treasury debt and are now offloading these debts in exchange for gold. China is not stupid, and it knows it could be a future victim of US sanctions itself.
You know, we probably wouldn't seize Great Britain's assets, but I could see us seizing China's assets.
Why would, I mean, that seems like theft. Just like take a country's assets. I mean, that belongs to the people of the country, right? It's not just Putin.
It is theft. Like, it's immoral, but even if you're okay with the amorality or immorality of it, it's short-sighted because eventually it'll catch up with us.
As you can see, this interview with Congressman Macy exposes a lot of truth, and it's why the other leading headline that BRICS is launching its own payment system was also significant this week. Here's a clip of Vladimir Putin speaking at the 2024 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which was held in Russia just last week. Pay attention to these words as he reveals the future of global trade.
По 23 год доля рубля в расчетах за российский экспорт выросла почти в 3 раза, до 39%, в 3 раза. Вместе с зарубежными партнерами будем наращивать применение национальных валют во внешнеторговых расчетах, повышать безопасность и эффективность таких операций. В том числе по линии БРИКС прорабатывается формирование независимой платежной системы, не подверженной политическому давлению, злоупотреблениями и внешнему санкционному вмешательству.
Now, if you listen exclusively to Western media, you probably will believe that Russia has been cut off from the outside world and that their economy is finished. But over 17,000 participants from over 130 countries attended this economic forum in Russia, as Putin laid out the future of the BRICS plan for global trade. Remarkably, just a few days after this economic summit, Russia held another meeting, which brought together the foreign ministers of each BRICS nation to outline the future goals of the organization. In total, there were 54 points addressed during this meeting, and I've read the entire report, so you don't have to. Here are the top 3 most important takeaways. Number 1, a new financial system. The BRICS organization wants to reform the entire global financial system to enhance the voice of developing nations and improve their access to international financial institutions. Under the current US dollar system, every country is under the mercy of the US government, and this remains the biggest motivation for BRICS. Create an independent payment system that uses local currencies in trade and one that is free from US sanctions and outside political pressure. Number 2, Israel-Palestine. I want you to look at this map, which shows the countries who recognize Palestinian statehood. Around 88% of the world's population lives inside these green countries, and this map is almost identical to the countries who also support de-dollarization and the rise of BRICS. The war in Gaza has become the latest political issue separating BRICS and the United States. The US will of course always support Israel, and quite frankly has proved useless in ending the war in Gaza. But the BRICS alliance will fight back and pursue a path of statehood for Palestine, something that once again 88% of the world's population wants to see. And number 3, the end of US sanctions. Now, the BRICS foreign ministers didn't specifically name the United States, but this point leaves no doubt as to who they were referring to. The ministers expressed concern about the use of unilateral coercive measures, which are incompatible with the principles of the Charter of the UN and produce negative effects on economic growth, trade, energy, health, and food security, notably in the developing world. What I want everyone to realize is that once you remove yourself from the Western media bubble and start to observe global trends, you'll notice the majority of the world are united in what they want. They want economic freedom, and this is why a shift away from the US dollar has begun. They want equal treatment, and this is why 88% of the world once again supports Palestinian statehood. Finally, they want a multipolar world where countries can do business and transact with as many nations as possible. Once again, this is why Saudi Arabia, who is also considering a full BRICS membership later this year, is opening up their oil trade to more countries and currencies around the world.
Yun. So just to summarize, no, sinasabi nila, there's a new financial system. The BRICS is already ready to implement this, and they're already dealing with many other countries. And what they want is there's not one currency that they would use as a reserve currency. When you say reserve currency po, ay yun yung parang pinakamalakas na currency sa buong mundo. And for last 50 years, it was the US dollar. Ngayon po, dahil sa pagbagsak ng US economy at pagtanggal nila, pag nag-outsource sila at pag tinanggal na nila yung manufacturing base nila at yung mga ang malakas na economies ngayon ay Russia, China, and India because they have manufacturing and they have agriculture and everything. So their currencies lumalakas. Ang currency po, again, emphasize po natin, ang pera mo is only as good as what your country produces. Okay? So yun yung strength ng isang currency ng isang bansa. Hindi dahil marami tayong OFW kaya malakas yung currency natin. Fake po yun. Yan ang mga henyo ng mga ekonomista na sinasabi, pinapaganda lang yung yung pagka-benta natin sa mga tao natin sa labas. But we're not producing anything anymore. So the value is even fake. It should be less, much less. Relative to the dollar, maybe relative to the Chinese renminbi and even the Russian ruble. But the nice part, itong magandang development na to, itong bagong financial system, you can transact based on your own currency. So they will put together what they announced, sabi ng BRICS, is they found out, and they did because of their analysis and their design of the new financial system. Meron isang reserve unit na magiging BRICS unit, parang ganon, where they will peg a value where countries can trade. Marami pang sumasali sa BRICS at baka sumali na yung Saudi Arabia diyan sa samahan na yan. And this is the most significant change. Nawawala na po yung tinatawag natin West, the global West, which is the US, Britain, at yung Atlantic countries. Germany at lahat. Mahina na po sila kasi namili sila ng gera kaysa sa development. This is happening over so many decades already. And this is very significant to the trade. And again, our economists and our central bank and our supposed experts are quiet over this development. And yung mga fellow media members natin, dapat yan ang tanongin nyo sa mga press con. Diba? Iyon ang unang tanong. Saudi virtually ended the petrodollar. How will this affect our Philippine economy, our trade, and our dollars in the central bank? Kasi ngayon, yung value ng dollar bumababa na. Kasi demand hindi na ganun kataas kasi hindi mo na kailangan bumili. We can buy Russian oil diretso sa Russia. We don't have to go through the US dollar. We don't have to exchange our peso with the dollar bago makabili. We can just exchange peso to ruble. We talk to Russia and say, bibili kami ng oil. Diba? Kung ang presidente, natin nag-iisip ng ganyan, hindi ganun kahirap ang taong bayan ngayon. Okay? Because now he sees what's happening in the world and then mag-act na siya. Because this really affects. What will happen in the near term is in the US, prices will go up. Mag-hyperinflation po sila. Yan ang iniisip kong pwede mangyari dahil yung kanilang trade agreements, yung dollar, bumababa na kasi yung countries will not now want to use the dollar. And therefore, pag hindi na ganun ka-attractive yung dollar, bababa yung value ng dollar vis-a-vis the trade with other currencies, mahihirapan na yung US. Yun ang nakakatakot. Nakakatakot para sa atin kasi kapit-tuko tayo sa US. Kung anong gusto sabihin ng US and Biden, doon tayo susunod. Again, the Titanic, tinamaan na yung iceberg. Anong gagawin natin? Cathy, comments?
Oo. May mga questions lang ako, parang paglilinaw lang, Itos. First, di ba, yung 50-year agreement na binabanggit kanina nung yung nagre-report, June 9, 2024 nagtapos at nag-open up na sa other currencies. Ngayon, sinasabi nga na ang palitan hindi na yung base sa dolyar, kundi sa sarili ng currency. So kung halimbawa si Pilipinas makikipag-trade ng sariling pera, peso, papunta dun sa So ang tanong ko na lang dito, kasi dati parang meron tayong basehan, yung dolyar halimbawa 50 pesos is to $1, di ba? So, paano ngayon yon? Is it yung BRICS ba? Mag-create sila ng isang unit to identify na, yun ang gusto kong maging malinaw lang.
Correct. That's why they're creating a common, sabihin na natin, common currency. Na kunyari, para may basehan. So, hindi, ang intindi ko, hindi 1:1 pa. Meaning, the 1 peso is to 1 ruble. Because definitely yung economy ng Russia ay mas malakas sa atin, right? So, ang significant lang dyan, pwede makipag-trade on goods and services with all other nations without going through the dollar. Kasi dati, hindi tayo makabili ng langis. We cannot import oil
Kung wala tayong
unless we have dollars. So ngayon, nagiging valuable yung dollars. Bibili tayo at bibili ng dollar, di ba? Kaya masaya tayo kasi yung dollar, OFW sends home dollars, di ba?
Yes, oo.
So, but now, the whole economy, the whole economics have changed. We can now even deal with China directly in terms of we don't have to go through the dollar, go through the and sabi nga ng isang report, nakakatakot yung banking system ng US ngayon. Because lahat ng transaksyon, lahat ng utang, lahat ng it's on dollar basis. When the demand falls or the dollar's value goes down, lahat ng transaksyon na yan, hindi mo na alam kung saan pupulutin. Because the BRICS now is moving towards creating a new financial system that will, based on their statements, that will value each nation's currency accordingly. So we don't have to lean on only one currency. Doon naging superpower yung US in the 70s to today. Dati, naging superpower yung US dahil malakas sila sa manufacturing. In time ni Franklin Roosevelt, the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1945 to 1971, it was based on physical infrastructure and it was based on fixed currencies. Ngayon, because of yung mga bankero at yung mga elite na gustong pumasok ulit, bumalik ngayon yung speculation. Naging floating exchange rate system. When you floating exchange, nothing is based on solid grounds. It's all based on computations by the IMF and the World Bank. Okay? So yung currency mo naging floating. Okay? So hindi na siya fixed exchange rate. Doon na lumaki. Doon na pumasok. And doon na nag-umpisa yung pababa ng world economy, lalo na sa US. Tapos yung arrangement ni Henry Kissinger sa Saudi is a political arrangement. Sige, we will give you arms, we will give you tanks and guns and pero yung benta nyo ng oil nakabase sa currency namin, sa dollar lang. Para lahat ng bansa susunod to. Ngayon, tumiwalag na. Lalo na tumiwalag yung mga malalaking economies. Saudi, China, Russia, India. Which for me is very, very, we're entering a new phase of gulo. Lalo na, dahil kaya gusto nila manggera.
Yes.
Okay? Kasi sabi nila, delikado na tayo dito. So, we've been talking about the danger of nuclear war, di ba?
Yes. Pero meron pa ako. Pasensya na ito sa medyo naglalaro lang. May dalawang words lang ako na naisip, no? One is, base dun sa pagpapaliwanag mo, Itos, nakikita ko na kung ang magiging basehan mo ay yung napoproduce ng isang bansa, no, para makipagpalitan ka kung kumbaga sariling currency mo na at iyong ipambibili, di parang mas maiengganyo ngayon ang lahat ng mga bansa na paunlarin ang kanilang o palakihin ang kanilang production para tumaas. Meaning, magkakaroon ng development, magkakaroon talaga ng production. Manufacturing industry, that's one. Ngayon, ang bigla lang pumasok sa isip ko nung sinabi mo yung fixed exchange rates. Naalala ko lang kasi kaibang-kaiba dun sa floating na pinapairal nila ngayon. Is it possible ba na ang floating exchange rate ay mabalik dahil dun sa sistemang correct me, parang
it's possible na bumalik yung fixed exchange rate.
Yes.
At floating. Floating na tayo ngayon, di ba?
Floating. Pero Dahil sa gagawin ngayon na sarili mong currency, is it magiging fixed na? Pangalawa is, di ba yung
Yes.
nung araw, barter kasi ang ginagawa, produkto sa produkto, palitan.
Yeah, pero that was long before there's an international system, no? Financial
Yes.
system. Kailangan pa rin yung international financial system. Kailangan pa rin yung currencies. Pero, you have to fix it, lalo na kung gusto mong i-rebuild yung mundo para secure at steady yung pag-angat ng mundo. Kunyari, kung hindi ka sigurado kung anong value ng currency mo next year, ba't ka mag-i-invest na malaki sa manufacturing o agriculture, di ba? So, kasi yun pang long term yun. Pero if it's a fixed exchange rate system, na the world can operate on this kind of financial system na fixed, you can plan 20 years ahead. Right? And the banks will follow that kind of system. Ang mawawala lang dyan sa mga Bretton Woods and yung mga yung speculation.
Yes.
Mawawala yung forex trading, which does not benefit anybody. Forex trading is purely speculation, gambling, and it's just to make money. Because aanhin mo yung pagte-trade ng dollar, kung hindi mo naman gagamitin, dito ka naman sa Pilipinas, piniperahan mo lang. Diba?
Yeah.
So, mawawala yun, which is good. So, just like the Bretton Woods, I think the BRICS, and they mentioned it before, we need to return to the Bretton Woods system. So yes, to answer your question, I'm more optimistic na babalik sila sa fixed exchange rate system. Because the reason they formed the BRICS is because it is a reaction, it is a negative reaction to the floating exchange rate system.
At dahil dyan, no, tama ka dun sa nasa isip mo kaya minamadali nila ngayon na magkagulo. Dahil, kumaga talagang hindi na nila mapipigilan, eto na si BRICS Para bang, pero ang maganda dito, is that meron tayong bihikulo, meron tayong sasakyan towards sa peace. Hindi yung totally na blind tayo at hindi natin alam kung ano ang magiging solusyon. This one, because of BRICS.
Kung sumama tayo sa BRICS.
Yes, yan yung magandang panawagan. At mamaya, yan ang hihingin ko sa yung panawagan mo sa ating pamahalaan, sa ating leader later on.
Yes, because if you follow the war, kasi yung delikado po natin ngayon, again, meron pathway. Yun na nga, pinapakita. Kaya yung topic natin ngayon na war or BRICS, di ba?
Yes.
Because two paths Either you go to the path of the future, which is international cooperation and development and peace, or sumama ka dito sa gusto magkagera para gulo-gulo na lahat. And the path towards the second one, yung gera po, is nuclear. And siguro hindi nakikita ng mga tao, siguro yung mga tao, marami kasing nagpapa-eksperto dyan, not just here, but in the US and all over na sabi nila hindi magkaka-nuclear, hindi tanga yung mga taong yan. Ang sinasabi natin, hindi, tanga sila. Gusto nga nila mag-nuclear war. Ang gusto nila, masira yung mundo, number one, because of depopulation. Number two, para sila pa rin ang mamumuno. So kinakalculate nila, kaya natin manalo. Ganon sila mag-isip. Kaya natin manalo sa nuclear. Pag banatan na, tayong tatayong at tayo pa rin ang maghahari. Ganon sila mag-isip. Okay, so but nobody, I guess, knows the actual pa talaga mangyayari pag nag-nuclear war. And I think this last video, just to emphasize the point of the danger we're in, I think we can look at this. I think it's about 12 minutes. Para makita natin at makita ng tagapakinig natin, marinig nila at mapanood nila ang talagang senaryo na ano talagang mangyayari pag nagkabombahan na. Diba?
Yes.
There, please play it.
If I was a fly on the wall, not that there would be a wall left, what would I, and I was looking at America or the UK after it had been struck by these nuclear bombs by thousands of, Russian or North Korean nuclear weapons, what would I see? What would the visuals be in those minutes after the strike?
I describe the first bomb in the scenario that strikes the Pentagon. It's a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb in painstaking, horrific detail, all sourced from Defense Department documents, defense scientists who have worked for decades to describe precisely what happens to things and to humans. And it's horrifying. But on top of the initial flash of thermonuclear light, which is 180 million degrees, which catches everything on fire in a 9-mile diameter radius. On top of the bulldozing effect of the wind and all the buildings coming down and more fires, igniting more fires, on top of the radiation poisoning people to death in minutes and hours and days and weeks, if they happen to have survived. On top of all of that, each one of these fires creates a mega fire that is 100 or more square miles. And so essentially, in essence, what do you see? Well, in the scenario at minute 72, 1,000 Russian nuclear weapons land on the United States. And so it just becomes a conflagration of fire. It's just fire, fires burning, fires, 100, 200 square mile fires burning. And then we move into nuclear winter. And that's sort of the denouement of the book, where I tell you about nuclear winter from the point of view of one of the original scientists who wrote that original nuclear winter paper with Carl Sagan back in 1983. And his name is Professor Brian Toon. And he spent the decades since working with the state-of-the-art climate modeling systems that can now precisely tell us what nuclear winter will look like.
Because I've always thought, you know what, nuclear war wouldn't be that bad. If, you know, Russia launched 1,000 of their nuclear bombs at the United States and I was here in New York where I am now, I would die instantly, so I wouldn't really know it had happened. Is that true?
I think you would want to die instantly. I mean, there's a quote from Nikita Khrushchev, the former premier of the Soviet Union, and he said, after nuclear war, the survivors would envy the dead. Because there is, right? There is this sense of if you survived, I mean, there is no more law and order. There is no more rule of law. There is no government. Craig Fugate made that very clear. The bunkers that the people in the military command and control centers would be in, let's say the secret bunkers, not the ones that are targets that Russia's going to take out, that I write about in the book, but the smaller ones, those are going to only function for as long as there's gasoline to run the diesel generators. And then those people are going to have to come out. And who's left? It's man returning to the most primal, most violent state as people fight over the tiny resources that remain. And by the way, they're all malnourished, everybody's sick, and most people have lost everything and everyone they know. How's that going to feel?
It's going to feel, as you describe here on page 277, there are 1,000 flashes of light superheating the air in each ground zero to 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, 1,000 fireballs, each more than a mile in diameter, 1,000 steeply fronted blast waves, 1,000 walls of compressed air, 1,000 American cities and towns where all engineered structures in 5, 6, or 7 miles radius change physical shapes, collapse and burn, 1,000 cities and towns with molten asphalt streets, 1,000 cities and towns with survivors impaled to death by flying debris, 1,000 cities and towns filled with tens of millions of dead people, with tens of millions of unfortunate survivors suffering fatal third-degree burns, people naked, tattered, bleeding, and suffocating, people who don't look or act like people anymore. Across America and Europe, hundreds of millions of people are dead and dying, while hundreds of military aircraft fly circles in the air until they run out of fuel. I mean, that is some visual. How many people would be dead or dying, do you think, after those 72 minutes?
Hundreds of millions of people die in the fireballs, no question. But the number that I think is very interesting to think about comes from Professor Toon and his team, who wrote a paper for Nature recently, 2022, and sort of updated nuclear winter idea based around food. And the number that they have is 5 billion people would be dead.
The population of the planet currently is what, 8 billion?
Yes.
So there'd be 3 billion people still alive. Where shall I go to be one of the 3 billion? I was just in New Zealand and Australia.
That's exactly where you'd go. Although, according to Toon, those are the only places that could actually sustain agriculture.
I was there 2 weeks ago. Not even 2 weeks ago. It was maybe 10 days ago. I was in New Zealand and Australia. And at that time, I think Iran attacked Israel.
Right. Yes.
I was kind of happy.
You were in the right place at the right time.
I was kind of happy for where I was located. If I'm gonna, and I was thinking, I actually remember I was talking to my friends and I pulled up a map and I was trying to see how far away I was from everything. I was thinking because World War III started trending on Twitter, I was thinking if it does break out now, I think I'm probably pretty well placed. Is that the place to be?
That is, according to Professor Toon. I mean, he was so generous with me. He shared a lot of his slideshows that he has for his students. And that is really pretty much what's left. I mean, because most of the world is, certainly the mid-latitudes would be covered in these, sheets of ice, the freshwater bodies. Places like Iowa and Ukraine would be just snow for 10 years. And so agriculture would fail. And when agriculture fails, people just die. And on top of that, you have the radiation poisoning because the ozone layer will be so damaged and destroyed that you can't be outside in the sunlight. And so people will be forced to live underground. And so you have to imagine people living underground, fighting for food everywhere except for in New Zealand and Australia. There was also another interesting detail that he shared with me that, 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and something like 70% of the known species. And Professor Toon compared nuclear war to that situation. And so when you really think about it, and again, this was also echoed by Craig Fugate, FEMA's director, you think about it, there's nothing we can do about an asteroid, at least not right now. And yet there is something, nuclear war is a man-made threat. And therefore, it has to be a man-made solution.
What is the solution?
I really believe that people motivate other people. It's like a fundamental truth on the smallest scale and on the biggest scale. And so there's one person who is incredibly powerful, and that is the President of the United States. For better or for worse, it's just the way it is. And so in the same way that the president has presidential sole authority to start a nuclear war, the president also has a very powerful pen with which he can write executive orders, an EO. And the story I tell on the hopeful note goes like this. When I was in high school in 1983, there was an ABC TV movie called The Day After. And it showed a fictional war between the United States and then Soviet Russia. It was horrific and terrifying, okay? 100 million Americans watched it. 100 million Americans. It's like the third of the population. And I think it was half the population then. President Reagan was one of those Americans. He had a private screening at Camp David. His advisors told him not to watch it. He did watch it. Before that, President Reagan was a hawk. He was pro-nuclear weapons. His position was the more nuclear weapons, the better. He was the one putting nuclear weapons in space with the Star Wars program, the SDI program, okay? He couldn't have been more pro-deterrence supremacy. He saw The Day After, and he changed his position. He wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed. His words. And he reached out to Gorbachev. And then they had a Reykjavik summit, a summit in Iceland, Reagan and Gorbachev. And through communication, right? Through both of them realizing this is madness, realizing what could happen, seeing the day after and realizing, my God, this cannot happen. And they famously issued a statement that said, the joint statement between the two of them said, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And the result of the Reykjavik summit was that the world has gone from 70,000 nuclear warheads. That was the all-time high. 70,000. Why do you need 70,000 nuclear warheads? That's what there were in 1986. And now, here we are, because of the reductions, because of the treaties, thanks to those two, 12,500 approximately nuclear warheads. That is the movement in the right direction. And it came from a dramatic story being told, and it came from the president taking action because people would not stand for this anymore. There were massive protests.
Do you believe we could ever get to zero? Honestly.
That is for the disarmament experts. I like to stay in my lane as a storyteller, as an investigative journalist. I like to give you the dramatic, fast read and then pass the baton to those who have been working on that issue for decades, because boy, are they qualified. I just had the great fortune of being invited to Brussels, where I was part of a nuclear expo, and there were members of the European Parliament in the audience. And there were all these disarmament people there, and I learned a lot about all of these groups. And they have the answer, and they are the ones that should be asked that question, and they are doing a lot to get us there.
Okay. Napanood natin yung video tungkol dito sa posibleng mangyari, no? Kung halimbawang maganap itong nuclear war na to, Itos.
Yeah, it is nakakatakot talaga, but it's good that you have people like this online, 'di ba?
Yes.
Nasa YouTube, nasa X, warning us about this. Kasi kung hindi, madadala tayo sa mga propagandista, 'di ba? Parang gusto na ng gera pero hindi na iniisip yung future or hindi na iniisip yung taong bayan. Ang iniisip na nila politiko. At palagay ko sa utak nila, iniisip nila hindi talaga mangyayari. At sinasabi ko na sa kanila ngayon, napakatangan nyo kung mag-iisip kayo ng ganyan. These are the experts around the world already being shown here, and being our opportunity to watch them and listen to them and what they've been saying. They've been warning. Walang gusto ng gera. And because it will not benefit anybody. And the way nuclear bombs work, missiles work, walang mabubuhay. Lahat talo. Hindi mangyayari dyan. There are other videos na pwede natin i-discuss mo ano talagang epekto. Marami po sa YouTube, marami po sa X, mag-research lang po kayo yung effects ng nuclear war at paano mag-uumpisa to, if ever. Teorya po ng mga nag-iisip ng ganyan. Pero nakakatakot talaga. And that's why all the more we have to listen to people that are rational and talaga nag-iisip na sa tama. Diplomacy is the best course. Nobody wants nuclear war. Yun lang po, Kat. That's my reaction.
Well, actually, kanina hindi ko makakalimutan yung word na nuclear winter. Naalala ko nung, di ba, yung sa Mount Pinatubo, nung pumutok siya, di ba? Ang layo ng inabot, hindi lang yung dun sa area ng Luzon. Hanggang dito sa Metro Manila, hanggang sa labas pa yata ng Pilipinas, umabot siya. Imaginein mo na lang kung ano ang naging epekto nito sa marami nating mga kababayan. Kung iisipin mo kung merong nuclear radiation, tapos lahat bagsak, meaning, sabi nga niya, there is no law and order. Gulo. As in, gulo talaga. Tapos wala kang Kung natatandaan nyo yung Yolanda, 'di ba? Gulo 'yon dahil sa kalamidad na nangyari. But this time, this is different.
Yes.
Mabuhay ka man, gugustuhin mo, namatay ka na lang sana.
Oo,
Diba?
yan ang sinasabi nila, parang the living will envy the dead.
Yes,
Kasi
exactly.
walang mabuhay. Kasi kung sabi mo nga, tama mo yung example mo, yung pinatubo, tapos nangitim, tapos yung mga pumunta sa atmosphere, blocking out the sun.
Ang agrikultura, sira.
Oh, hindi pa nga yung tumagal, di ba? Nag-apekto yan, yung mga dust and yung mga dinala ng hangin, pumunta sa ibang bansa, na-apekto rin.
Yes.
Pero hindi na block out yung sun. Ito, pag nagawa to, isang bombang malaki, maybe 15 kiloton or something, which is already 1,000 times, 100 times bigger than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Hindi lang yung mga namatay kaagad pag naputokan tayo. Yung nuclear winter, sinasabi nila, iba-block out niya yung sun mga 4 years.
Grabe.
So walang tutubo. Tapos yung tubig, kontaminado na.
Yes.
Walang electricity, walang internet, walang lahat. So, paano ka mabubuhay? Di ba?
Exactly.
So, siguro, maliban na lang kung meron kang nakatago mga canned goods at lahat sa bahay mo kung buhay ka pa. Diba?
Hindi rin tatagal dito.
Hindi
Definitely.
tatagal. Kung 4 years yan, tsaka hindi ka wala na. Hindi parang, tapos paglabas mo, hindi mo alam, papatayin ka ng ibang tao dahil sa kain. Diba?
Oo.
Diba? So, that's the scenario that we're looking at sabi nga nila Armageddon, end of the time. Pero sabi nga ni Annie Jacobson, sabi niya, ang meteor na tamaan yung Earth, hindi natin kontrolado yun.
Yes.
Ito kontrolado natin.
Because it's
Right.
man-made.
It's man-made. So, sabi niya, this is what people should think about. Pero, sabi ko nga, ang intensyon ng mga to ay gera. Kaya nga, nag-warning tayo 6 months ago, start of the new year, sabi ko, there's going to be an escalation. And there's going, not because of it was happening, it's because they want it to happen. These guys, who's they? Yun yung mga sinasabi natin mga elite, yung mga Western banks, Western leaders. Because talo na sila sa sistema. Wala na. So, ang gusto lang nila, gulo, buong mundo, kasama sa gera, inisip nila, kinakalculate nila, ina-analyze nila, sila ang mamumuno pa rin. Ganun po sila mag-isip. Hindi mo maintindihan ng tao pero kung nasa poder ka, inisip mo kung paano ka ayaw mo umalis doon. So this is what's happening now. Despite the new financial system, despite the BRICS, despite the efforts for peace, the real peace, matigas pa rin ang ulo. So we're going to have to expect more upheavals in the coming weeks, the coming months. Tuloy-tuloy po yan. And hope you keep joining us dito sa Ating Katipunan every Sunday kasi tayo lang nagbabalita ng ganito.
At lagi tayong nakatutok sa loob at labas ng ating bansa sa mga kaganapan dahil importante na makita natin, updated tayo sa mga nangyayari dahil hindi porke yan gulo lang ng Russia and Ukraine and US and China, hindi na tayo kasama doon. Wake up, people! Wake up, Filipino people! Yan ang lagi sa ating sinasabi ni Scott Ritter. Paulit-ulit yan na naririnig natin sa mga social media and even in our report sa mainstream ngayon. Kaya, it's high time. It's high time na really na magkaroon ng panawagan, itulak natin ang ating pamahalaan. And bago tayo tuluyang magtapos, it's already 8:37 na. Nasa ikalawang bahagi na po tayo ng ating palatuntunan. Philippine Standard Time po at kayo po ay nakikinig pa rin sa impilan po ng RMN DZXL 558 kHz AM band at sabayan niyo po kaming napapanood sa pamamagitan ng social media accounts ng Katipunan Channel. Please like, share, and subscribe ang ating pong mga YouTube accounts, ang ating pong Facebook page, of course, ang Twitter, ang X po natin, napaka-importante po niyan, and of course, in Rumble. At lagi po kayong tumunghay sa ating mga social media accounts dahil marami po kaming mga updates ngayon dyan at kung hindi man nyo po nakikita sa mainstream, dito po bisitahin nyo. But we assure you na lagi po kayong ibibigay po namin sa inyo ang katotohanan. At kung hindi man po ninyo naintindihan, mag-iwan lamang po kayo ng mensahe sa atin pong mga social media accounts para po sa pag-oras na po ng ating palatuntunan ay ipapaliwanag po sa atin ni Itos. At sama-sama po tayo, pag-aralan po natin, tignan po natin ito kung papaano po, ano po ang nangyayari sa ating bansa. Well, it's time to read the text messages sent by our listeners. Their opinion does not necessarily reflect our own, but we reserve the right to read them to the public in the interest of freedom of speech. Of course, we have first text, si Christopher Cruz. Great show, keep it up. At sabi naman ni Fernando Rosales, yan, present daw siya. Naka-check-in sa atin. At si Victima 147, wala siyang I'm Jake, pero magising kung bulag sa pera. Paano magising kung bulag sa pera? Nga, no? Pero at the end of the day, alam nyo po, baliwala po yung pera. Kung nagkakagulo na, at sabi nga ni Itos kanina, di ba, kung talagang totally na devastated na lahat, ano pa? Ano pa ang silbi ng pera nyo? At sabi naman ni Vian, bago to. Sabi niya, good evening KDP at sa lahat Ang WPS ay wala sa mapa, South China Sea po yun. Ang Philippine Sea po ay nasa kabilang banger ng South China Sea. Ang COVID at gera ay gawa ng US. Sabi naman ni Lawrence Robert Tampus Halpin, good question and elaboration, Ma'am Cathy. Na-triggered si Marine Officer Scott Ritter and showed tough love sa Pinas. Nag-viral ang reels na yon. West Philippine Sea Worthless Piece of yan. And si BBM ang nagtutulak na pumasok ang mga kano sa situation sa ASEAN. Hindi ko akalain na hilig pala nito ay chaos at confusion. Yung peace conference for me is to pressure Russia to the Western demands. They don't want peace. Para si Junior, ikot ng ikot. Zelensky, 2.0 talaga. Grow up. BBM, Gibo, Anyo, Tariela, Batong Bakal, Haidiran, Virus, et al. At mula naman kay Richard Ong, West Philippine Sea wasn't recognized by any geographical publishing company because it's not even recognized by UN. At mula naman kay Joey Realmidi, bakit ayaw makipag-usap si Leonor sa Beijing para diplomacy? Walang girian. Ayaw kasi ng kano na gawin ni Junior. Ano sabi ni Scott Ritter sa Pinoy? Grow up! At mula naman kay Gina Benbiahe, good evening to all, especially to Sir Itos and Kat. OFW from Cyprus. Thank you for keeping us being informed. At mula naman kay Cappuccino, masarap ang kape mo. Titigil lang si Putin kung ibibigay ni Zelensky yung territory na gusto ng Russia. At mula naman kay Richard Ong, titigil si Putin kung ititigil ng US-led NATO ang expansions to curb Russia. US was behind NATO. Only the destruction of US will end wars. At sabi ni Rosales, USA nga, di mananalo sa China. Puro antik pa ang armas na bigay sa atin. May 20 pa tapos, May 20 pa tapos ang presidency ni Zelensky. Kung kaibigan ka, hindi ka isasabak sa gulo sa kapakinabangan niya. Love thy neighbor and China is our neighbor. At sabi naman ni Arguelles Joselito, alin po ba mapa ang kinikilala ng United Nations, WPS o Treaty of Paris na binigay sa atin? At sabi naman ni Ong, Arguelles Joselito, there is no such thing as WPS. Walang West Philippine Sea at gawa-gawa lang ni Noynoy Aquino ang WPS. Walang World Atlas ang nakalagay sa WPS. At mula naman kay Vice Counter, nang dahil sa maliliit na bato sa South China Sea, makikipagpatayan ng Pilipinas para sa US laban sa China at maaaring magsimula ng pandaigdigang nuclear world war. Diyos ko! Yan ang sabi ni Vice Counter. At sabi naman ni Roby Ledesma, good evening to all. At mula naman kay Lawrence Robert Campus Halpin, very little group of people who knows about this. China is our friend, our neighbor, and US would lose in a hot war. The US purpose is to use us Pinoys to bring down the GDP of China by 35%. At mula naman kay Fernando, na Zelensky is a comedian by profession. Sabi ni Richard naman, maraming Russian people na nakatira sa Donbas, Luhansk, Donetsk at ang pinagpapatay ni Zelensky since 2014. G7 countries, most of them are now on economic decline. Japan Kishida was hated by many Japanese cause the price of yen continuously falling. At sabi ni Kapo, Chino, ready na, tulong kay Zelensky galing sa katatapos na G7 dito sa Europe. Gusto ni Putin, aalis ang Ukraine sa NATO. At sabi ni Richard, Ukraine wasn't part of NATO because some other countries were against its membership. Mula naman kay Vian, adik din kasi si Zelensky. Tulad ni Bangag, kaya yes sir na lang ang yes sir. Sabi ni Fernando Rosales, Putin's SMO objective is demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Kinasuhan pa sa ICC dahil kinupkop ni Putin ng mga bata at matanda sa Russia. Sabi ni Ong, expansion ng US-led NATO ang ikinagalit ng Russia dahil unti-unti nang pinapakita ng US-NATO ang tunay nilang layunin. Pabagsakin ng Moscow, yan ang layunin ng US-NATO. At mula naman kay Jan, na first time ko siyang nakita dito, may nanalo ba sa gera? Ilan ang namamatay sa mga gera? Ilang infrastructure, building, lupa at iba pa ang namamatay? At mula naman kay Eric Gray, it's a wake-up call for the Philippine government and for the Filipinos. The Americans are not our friend, never was. They'll involve us in an unwinnable war. Scott Ritter said it best and on point. Sabi ni Roby Ledesma, tama si Duterte noon pa yan. Sinasabisa natin. Okay. Sinasabi sa atin. Okay. At sabi ni Kapu, katatapos lang ng petrodollar. At sabi ni Lawrence, dapat matagal na tayo bumili ng yuan. Sabi naman ni John, nangyayaring gera dahil sa interest ng mga corrupt politicians, corrupt organization, nakawan ng natural resources. Yan ang sabi ni John. At sabi ni Fernando, petrodollar by Nixon/Kissinger expired last May. Sabi ni Robert, babagsak na ang USD. At mula naman kay Vian, wala na ang US at EU. Tapos sabi uli ni Ann, kung nangangailangan sila ng maraming pera, bakit hindi nila inuutusan ng mga bangko, Canon Printing Press na gumagawa ng maraming pera? At sabi ni Sir Veliano Gonzaga Jr., better for the Philippines to join BRICS. At sabi ni Robert, ala na tayo ginto. Okay. At sabi ni Hannah, good evening po, watching from Leyte. Thank you, Hannah. At mula kay Lynn Mutas Sarko, good evening po, Ma'am Cathy and Sir Itos. Thank you po, Ma'am Lynn. At mula kay Brian Neil Librando, first time listener here. Thanks, Miss Cathy Cruz, for asking your question at the press con of the Schiller Institute. Sad that the mainstream media doesn't care about this at all. Are they all paid or in cahoots with? Well, actually, Brian, nagpapasalamat ako sa ibang mga mainstream na kinapture nila ang nangyaring emergency press con na ito ng Schiller. At especially to Manila Times, SMNI, and meron ding iba pang mga vloggers din na kilala na nag-share ng atin. So, thank you to all. Anyway, bago po tayo tuluyang magpilid ng ating palatuntunan, hingan muna natin ng mensahe ang Pangulo ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, walang iba kundi si Itos Valdes. Itos?
Yeah, thank you, Cathy, and thank you sa mga reactions natin and questions, no? And comments, no? We welcome that. Again, I would like to encourage na lahat ng nanonood at nakikinig sa atin. Please do a lot of research. Nandun na sa labas. Do not just limit your perceptions or your information sa mainstream media o binibigay ng mga dyaryo, radyo o TV dito sa atin. Kasi most of that, kulang na kulang ang binibigay sa atin na informasyon. So, right now, swerte po tayo. You have so many platforms, no? Rumble, Twitter, YouTube, tsaka even Facebook sometimes, na lahat ng katotohanan lumalabas. And not just on this nuclear war danger and the politics, but also on the health. Marami po nangyayari, lalo na tungkol sa pharmacies and the recent lockdowns and the supposed jabs, no? Ang dami po nangyayari dito at it's good to be informed on this. So I would encourage na tuloy-tuloy lang ang pag-research nyo. Listen to the experts, the real experts, at wag yung mga na-mention kanina mga pangalan ng mga local experts na wala namang alam. They are propagandists. We can say that because we've listened to them for a while. Pare-pareho lang ang sinasabi nila. Sinasabi lang quote-unquote political analysts, but they do not deal with the realities of the world that's happening. So, we are in a very dangerous position pa rin, situation sa world. We are on the brink of probable open war. I want to add also sa US now, nagpasa sila ng law na ita-draft na yung mga 18 to 24 na lalaki. When they do that, nag-institute na naman ng draft, gegera talaga sila or they're preparing for war. It's unfortunate, but they're going to send a lot of young people again to their deaths. Like the Vietnam War, which wasn't really and then lahat ng ibang mga gera na manufactured naman nila. So this is what's happening now sa mundo. So, and the counter to that is to join with nations that do not want war and want to create a new system of peace and development for all. And for what we've seen, it's the BRICS. So if anybody in our administration, President Marcos and his cabinet members are listening to that, we appeal that you join and consider putting the Philippines on good standing with the BRICS right now. The Titanic has struck the iceberg. Let's go to the lifeboats. It's useless to wait around because it's going to sink. It is sinking already. So yun ang mensahe ko. Thank you sa mga engineers sa Radyo Mindanao Network for always being alert and supporting us here, and all of our listeners and friends who continue to support and get involved in the discussion. It is our future that we need that's in our hands. We have to take control of it and make sure that the future generations are able to flourish because of what we did today. Yun lang, Kath. Good night.
Good night, Titos, and thank you sa iyong mensahe. At syempre, bago po tayo tuluyang magpinid ng palatuntunan, ay gusto ko lamang pong iwanan po sa inyo ang salitang ito. No? Tandaan po natin, anuman po ang ginagawa natin ngayon, mababaliwala yang mga pangarap ninyo at gagawin pa ng pamahalaan natin na sinasabi nilang para bumuti ang buhay natin kung tayo ay haharap sa isang digmaan. Walang sino mang talo o panalo. Lahat, obviously, talo nung pinaliwanag sa atin ang epekto ng nuclear war. At sana po Pakinggan nyo ang panawagan ng Pangulo ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino na si Itos Valdes. Dahil oras na po para tayo ay umanib sa isang organisasyon, tinatawag nating BRICS, para nang sa ganon na makaiwas tayo sa napipintong digmaan. Lagi po tayong maging mapagmatsyag, suriin at alamin ang katotohanan, maging bukas ang tenga at kaisipan, matutong magsaliksik at balikan ang kasaysayan dahil nagbibigay ito sa atin ng aral upang mailantad kung sino ang tunay na sinungaling na sumisira sa ating bansa at sa buong mundo. Huwag matakot manindigan sa tama, hindi ito madali. Ilabas ang katotohanan dahil sa dulo, tayo ang lilikha ng isang makatarungan, payapa at maunlad na kinabukasan para sa ating kabataan. Gisingin ang ating mga pinuno sa publiko at sa pribadong sektor na ang pangangalaga ng tao, pagtataguyod ng pangkalahatang kapakanan at kabutihang panglahat, at ang pagsustulong ng kapayapaan ay dapat na kanilang pangunahing interes at pananagutan. With that, sa ngalan po ng Katipunan o Katipon ng palatuntunang ito at ang pamunuan ng Radio Mindanao Network at Katipunan Channel, lalo na po yung mga magagaling natin transmitter engineers at technician, mga broadcast technician sa loob at labas ng himpilan po ng DZXL kay Ver Archivido, kina Engineer Dominador Abogado, Valentin Villafica, Resurrection Ray Albesa, kay Erwin Makatangay, Cecilio Valencio, Alex Abelon Sr., kay Chris Narvaez, Daniel Fagunilo, kay Richard Ramirez. Maraming pong salamat sa inyo at sa lahat po ng bumubuo at pamunuan po ng RMN DZXL. Kami po ay pansamantalang nagpapaalam at nagpapasalamat na sinamahan ninyo kami, ang Hora de Peligro ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo. Hanggang sa linggo pong muli mga katipon, alas 7 hanggang alas 9 ng gabi. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat.
Inyong napakinggan si Itos Valdes kasama si Cathy Cruz at iba pang katipon na nakilahok sa talakayan.
Ating Katipunan.
Samahang muli si Itos Valdes sa susunod na linggo alas 7 hanggang alas 9 ng gabi sa himpilan ng RMN DZXL 558 kHz AM band at social media accounts ng Partido KDP.
Ating Katipunan.